Hey, I'm Nico, and this is my second demo video for Review Board as a part of UCOSP Fall 2017, and my project is Message Bus. So just to recap what Message Bus is, it's essentially a way to make aggregated message requests to the server and get corresponding messages from it. And all these message requests are aggregated into one HTTP request and also one HTTP response with all the payloads. So in my last demo video, I showed off the message requests being registered and how the message bus on the client side handles all that, and how the server has a registry of message providers which just take the message requests and pass the parameters onto the message provider, which then returns a payload, which in that time was just a JSON object, back to the bus, and then at the end of the day back to the client. A lot of that has since changed, not so much the client side, but on the server side. So the client side, the most notable change is the actual message request object. Before it was just a regular JavaScript object, and I've changed in favor of a backbone model with some defaults such as tag, which is just going to be a tag to show or to keep track of the state of the data of a message request, the update timestamp, which is when it was last updated, and then data, which is essentially the arguments that are going to be passed to the actual message provider down the line. And each of this is just the parent class. So each individual message request is actually going to implement its own variation of this by extending the message request. And each of the message requests are going to have to define its own message provider ID, which will correspond to the message provider ID that the review or that the message provider is registered with in the registry back on the server side. And in this case, since we're talking about review request updates, we need to pass a review ID, which just represents the review request ID that you want to update or get the updates for. And this gets added to the data, like so. All right, so on the server side, a lot has changed since before, and in large part that had to do with some change or to how I was handling the providers themselves. So before I just had the get messages, which returned a JSON object. Now, the JSON object isn't actually the payload format we wanted. We wanted it to be a very specific one, which includes the length of the metadata, line break, the metadata itself, then the length of the HTML content, line break, and then the HTML content itself. So that represents one payload. And there are multiple payloads. So for each, there can be multiple payloads added to the response. So all of those would just be concatenated to that with the same format. And most notably, I've added to the parent provider, message provider class, I've added a write update function, which essentially takes a payload parameter, which is the string IO, or just a string IO object, which allows you to write the exact payload format to the back to the response later down the line, and takes the metadata and HTML components of the payload as arguments as well. So an example of this this new format implemented is the review request updates provider, which mimics what the review request updates view does. And so essentially the review request updates view or just renders into this little template here. If you go to r/ the number of a review request / _ updates, you can get the review request or review request update or payloads from that. So what we did is we took that and we transitioned it to message bus now. So we transitioned it to message bus, and that's all handled by this. A lot of this code was actually reused directly from the review request updates view class that's already existed, but it's been modified and to work in the context of a message bus. So so I'll show you that in action. So this is the existing payload. And this is, once I refresh this, you can see it on the side already. This is message bus actually accessing that payload at a periodic interval, which is 10 seconds. So we won't see the update immediately. But yep, it's the exact same information, and what that will allow us to do down the line, it's not currently implemented, but what that will allow us to do is actually come to the review request page model, which is currently the client-side handler for review request updates, and allow us to actually use message bus to update it, which is ultimately the end goal for what I want to do with message bus until we let message bus be used across the as a generic tool for message updates. Aside from that, the client side currently doesn't handle the payload, so it just gets printed off, and that's because I need to discuss more about how we want that to be handled. And finally, I believe the last thing I want to implement is a caching mechanism, which essentially just takes a tag and compares tags together, and if the tags are the same, it would indicate that there's no point in updating the data because the client already has the most updated data, and to not return the payload, which will just save on information being sent. So yeah, that's message bus in its current state, and I look forward to more progress in the next demo video. Thanks a lot.